saying that for any little boy that has a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And for the Kennedy School, every event requires a forum. But there's actually a special history to this forum that I'd like to describe for those of you who are new this year, which is to recall the atmosphere in this space a year ago this morning. It was quite extraordinary in the sense that we had people milling around. We had that big screen going and the pictures of the burning towers, and nobody knew quite what to do. And it's always important when you think of crises, in retrospect, things look much more clear than they are. When you're in government, you notice that there's always a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion. In addition to the scenes of the towers burning, which was very clear, might recall for you that there was a CNN report that there was a car bomb at the State Department. Turned out that was totally false. It had dropped off everybody's screen, but I don't know, around 11 o'clock in the morning or something, when I was called into Bonnie Newman's office about the report on the car bomb in the State Department, it raised questions of, is this a wide-scale bombing? Were we at risk? What might be done? Later in the day, or a little bit later, there was a report, again on CNN, of an attack on Kabul in Afghanistan with a picture of flashing ammunition dumps and so forth. Again, turned out to be a false alarm. Something had exploded, but it wasn't an attack on Kabul. And it's worth remembering that sense of chaos at the time of the crisis. On that morning in this room, everybody felt pretty unhinged. Nobody knew what was happening, and there was a great deal of uncertainty. One idea that somebody suggested was, well, we ought to close down the school because there might be a danger. We tried to see if there was a danger in the sense of any particular reports that might suggest that we should close down. We decided that closing down, unless there was a clear report of danger, would be a great mistake. It was far better for us as a community, even though we didn't know what was happening, even though things were chaotic, to come together and, in fact, to do what we knew how to do, which was discuss things together. So we held a forum here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I would say that that forum had a very powerful effect of pulling this Kennedy School community together. It wasn't that the people on this podium knew what was happening. We hadn't a clue. But it was the fact that we launched something for our own internal community, which had very little speaking, brief presentations from the people on the stage, but allowed people in the audience to say what they thought or ask questions or have a conversation. That sense of communicating, of trying to make sense of chaos, is what we do well. And it had the effect, perhaps not of producing a great deal of knowledge, but it did produce a good, strong sense of community. And it's that sense, I think, that we felt that we should commemorate the anniversary, the one-year anniversary, not merely with this morning's wonderful ceremony, wonderful because of that piece by Mahler that Terry McGinty, our graduate, played, which is so much better than words. Music really does do better than words. We can't do that well tonight, but we can at least have a forum which is different from our normal forums in the sense that this is the community, this is the school, this is not the usual forum for people from Boston and from, the whole university. It's primarily us. And we can ask questions about what do we know now that we didn't know a year ago? What have we learned? What do we still need to learn? And in that sense, we have for you a very interesting panel to start discussion, but the discussion really is for all of us, for all of you. To my immediate left, Jessica Stern was a member of that original 3 o'clock panel in the midst of chaos. Jessica is a lecturer here at the school who has written about terrorism, who has interviewed terrorists in Pakistan, who worked on the National Security Council on the issue of terrorism. And when I don't understand it, and I really don't, I turn to Jessica and ask, what is this? What's happening? So she's not just a national authority, she's my authority. Ash Carter, to Jessica's left, is a professor here at the school who spent September 11th trying to get back from Washington to Cambridge, and I think wound up having to drive, if I remember correctly, so he couldn't be on the panel. Ash was my colleague as a former Assistant Secretary of Defense and has done many distinguished things, but I think some of the things he has written in the past year, and even before 9/11, about Homeland defense have been the most clear-headed of any that I've read. Fred Schauer, to Ash's left, is blessedly for him on leave this year. He last year chaired the second panel we had, which included the issue of civil liberties. That was a panel we had 1 week later. And Fred was at the time the academic dean of the school. He is the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment here at the school, but a man whose counsel I have always sought, but I can't think of anybody better to lead us on these issues of civil liberties. Dan Glickman is new. So we have a panel, and deliberately so, which is mixed in terms of who was on and who was off a year ago. Dan Glickman is our new director of the Institute of Politics, and we're just delighted to have him here at the school. He, as a congressman, served on the Intelligence Committee, among others, as a cabinet official in Bill Clinton's cabinet. He was Secretary of Agriculture, but as a man who was always known as able to see things from both sides of the aisle and earn the respect of people on both sides of the partisan divide, and we're going to ask him for some perspective on domestic politics. We're not going to have speeches. I'm going to ask people a question. They're going to speak briefly to answer the question, and then we're going to throw it open to you and get a broader discussion going. So that's the drill for the evening. Let me start with Jessica and ask, what do we know now that you wish you'd known a year ago when you sat in this spot about the terrorists who are involved, and what do we still need to know?
Well, I'd like to focus on one thing we know, which I think it represents an evolution in how Al-Qaeda is operating. I think there's always a trade-off between short-term, in this case, national security objectives, and longer-term objectives, foreign policy objectives, or getting to the root causes of terrorism. And I think that our military action has, unfortunately, ended up forcing Al-Qaeda to form a new kind of terrorist organization, which is a kind of hybrid between two kinds of organizations that I'm seeing in my interviews of terrorists. One being a virtual organization where the leader never gets involved in activities himself. A lot of the communication is on the internet. There's people, individuals, and cells are taking action on their own. And a more traditional industrial style organization which has commanders and cadres. So what's happened with Al-Qaeda is that we see this hybrid, which is a very robust organization made up both of little cells but also franchises. And I want to give you an example of one of those franchises. We are all thinking about Indonesia today, groups in Indonesia. I had the opportunity to interview the leader of one of the jihadi groups in Indonesia a couple of years ago. One of my students actually invited me, told me about this, to come. He was working in Indonesia. And it was, this man had very clear objectives in Indonesia related to shifting demographics, political representation. But this group is cooperating as a kind of franchise in some cases for Al-Qaeda, this group and others like it. And the one, of course, that we're most concerned about is Jamaah Islamiyah. This is the reason why our embassies are closed. So that's a development which I find very troubling. But I want to shift very briefly to say something about what we've learned about ourselves, because I think when we look at our adversaries, we should always be aware of how we ourselves, our perceptions are being affected by our own values, our own limitations, and so on. Well, what have we learned about ourselves? One thing is we've learned a lot about the weaknesses in our intelligence community. We've discovered that we're really not very good at spying in places where operatives might get diarrhea or have to drink filtered water. And this is a real problem. On the positive side, I think it turns out that we are, our commitment to American values and tolerance is more robust, I think, than perhaps we anticipated when we were sitting here a year ago. I think that it looked really bad in the day when we were sitting here a year ago. It looked as though we really had to worry about Pakistanis being targeted, actually even Indians being targeted because people got confused. We learned that we had, I think, a stronger spirit than I would have expected. I think that we've recovered. In the long term, it seems to me that one measure of psychological well-being is not just that we can love and work, as one very famous thinker said, but also that we're able to take whatever pain comes our way and turn it into something good and have it inspire us to be better people. And so I'd like to think that we, in remembering September 11th, that we think about how we can use that pain to do something good.
Thank you. Ash, you have been working hard advising one of our Kennedy School faculty members, Rich Falkenrath, who's working for Governor Ridge. There have been major efforts on the Homeland defense front, but there's still a long way to go. How much safer are we than we were a year ago in terms of Homeland defense, and how much more do we have to do?
Well, let me try to give you a scorecard on what I see as the two fronts of this campaign. But first, let me just recall something, Joe, if I may, that I remember saying last year when I did get back from Washington, and we had another forum the next day, and people, I looked out on the audience, and people had that sort of stunned look on their face. And I said something then that I want to repeat to this group of mainly new students, which is, we need to pick ourselves up and get on with the job of facing this new public policy problem. And today has been a day of remembrance and mourning and introspection and reflection, and people saying, what has this meant for America, and how do we feel about this, and what does it say about us, and so forth. And that's very important. But to you out here, our students, this is not a spectator activity. In 2, 3, very short number of years, shorter number than you can appreciate right now, you're going to be out there with real responsibility in this or some other problem of comparable importance. I have in students, I can just think of a few of them right off the top of my head, who I have, 2 of them are in the Department of Homeland Security now, working on these very problems. I have one who's a B-52 pilot who was engaged in Operation Enduring Freedom. I have a former ISP 205 student who is at an undisclosed location with the Vice President. A young woman of tremendous ability who was in my class a couple of years ago and has a job there. So very shortly you'll find yourself in a position where those people you were seeing on TV who are mourning or reflecting, Americans of all ages, are looking to you because you've dedicated your life to solving these kinds of problems. And that's the job you've taken on, that's the calling you've answered, and you're responsible for the solution for these problems. So it's not a matter of reflection on them. You have to say to yourself, what are we going to do about them? Now, the two fronts on which we need to act and have acted are first dealing with Al-Qaeda, and I'll give my little report card, Joe, if I may there, and the second is the broader question of terrorism and homeland security. And there, I don't think we've made as much progress. On al-Qaeda, and Jess, I hope would agree with this, I think we have been largely successful as I expected last year. We would be in the ensuing year. We have removed a large and stable base of operations, namely the country of Afghanistan, from al-Qaeda. We have eliminated effectively much of the senior leadership of al-Qaeda. I don't know whether Osama bin Laden is dead or not, but the sort of next most effective alternative to that, namely he's acting dead, it seems to be the case. And that's almost as good, because he's not directing operations and he's not inspiring people to keep this up. The pressure's on them, and if they're acting in as a bunch of disaggregated small cells or franchises, that is a substantial victory. It doesn't mean you've gotten rid of the problem, but it's a substantial victory. I think we in the world correctly diagnosed the problem, which I think Joe mentioned was not clear to many people in this audience last year, which is that this was not an attack on America in any simple sense. It was an attack on modernity by a group in a particular part of the world associated with a particular culture that that was having a civil war within itself between those who wanted to roll the clock back and those who wanted to carry forward, and that we were, in a sense, collateral damage. We understood that and contained our own anger. The rest of the world understood that and directed the action where it needed to be. In that part of the world, the president said, if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists, and that woke up a considerable number of foreign leaders. One of them visited this school a few days ago. Pervez Musharraf, and the frame of mind that he's in is reflective of that challenge. So I think all of that has gone tremendously well. And my prediction is that al-Qaeda, at least in years to come, will move from the stage of history, will be a nuisance level problem, and we will have succeeded in reducing it to that level. But let me remind you of something else, and this is where the second front comes in. And we didn't know this on September 12th when we had that forum last year. We didn't know that we were about to suffer another attack. Those were the anthrax mailings. Everybody forgets that. But the anthrax mailings, were they to have succeeded, and there were spores all over, and it only takes one to infect you in the lungs, and remind you with pulmonary anthrax, when you're symptomatic, you've had it. That could have rivaled the 3,000 death toll of 9/11, and that's not a solved problem yet. We don't even know who did it. Moreover, and this is the part that you really need to bear in mind, the indications are that was an American, quite possibly acting alone. And that tells you two things. It can be us, too. It's not just somebody else. And in this world, who's American and who's not American, it becomes less clear every year also. And acting alone, destructive power is falling into smaller and smaller numbers of hands as technology progresses. This individual quite possibly acting alone. My guess is a cleared American, a member of the trusted member of the national security community. And what that tells me is that if we think about terrorism broadly, you're talking about a condition of humanity going forward where most of us will live in a complex, interconnected, and therefore fragile society. And those few of us who are aberrant for whatever reasons, one particular mindset, which is the al-Qaeda one, but there are lots of them out there, those aberrant groups and individuals will be able or potentially capable of doing terrible destruction. That's a problem of governance for civilization going forward as far into the future as we can see. Long after al-Qaeda is gone, we don't remember who they are. That's a deep problem. How much progress have we made there? Well, Joe has been working on this as well. This is a new problem for humanity. It challenges in our country things that we have gotten away with for a couple hundred years, like a separation between foreign wars and foreign security apparatus, and which is about wars and foreigners, and domestic law enforcement, which is about criminals whom you allow to commit crimes, and then you catch them after they've done it. Well, none of those models is appropriate to this problem. So we are in the very early stages, and this here, Joe, I can't report much progress on this. We are in the early stages still as a nation and a world in organizing governance to deal with this enduring human problem. There I can't report as much progress, Joe.
Thank you, Ash. Fred, one of the key areas of governance is this trade-off of security and civil liberties, and as Jessica reminded us, at the first forum we had a year ago, we recalled the experience of World War II and the fact that as a society, even a liberal president like Franklin Roosevelt, under the conditions of fear, did badly in terms of the way Japanese Americans were treated. And President Bush, I think, rose to the occasion well in speaking up, involving Muslim clerics in the White House in religious ceremonies to indicate that this was not to be a situation of which a single group was identified and as the perpetrators or culprits. But at the same time, even though that we've done better than expected, that we expected a year ago on that, there's been a great deal of concern about some of the actions of secret courts and some of the actions that Attorney General Ashcroft has taken. How do you sum up the balance of where we are now compared to a year, or where we thought we were a year ago on the civil liberties front?
I think one way of thinking about it is to think about where we were a year ago. And it is possible that what's happened in the last year is quite small compared to what's happened in the last 30. The first task force on hijacking was set up in 1968. It issued its recommendations in 1971. In 1971, if you were going to fly on a plane, what would happen is you would be subject to a profile, as with anybody seeking to fly. Based on the profile, somewhere between 3 and 4% of all passengers were asked to go through a metal detector. Only 3 or 4%. If you went through the metal detector and then you were found to have more than a certain amount of metal, then you were approached by an airline employee who would ask to see identification. Only if you refused to provide satisfactory identification would you then be approached by a marshal or someone else with law enforcement authorities. And only if that encounter still raised suspicions would you be subject to a physical frisk. I think the interesting comparison is not between that sequence and yesterday, but that sequence and 370 days ago. There are differences between today and 365 days ago, but those are much smaller than the differences between 370 days ago and 1968 or 1971. In some respects, this shouldn't be surprising. The Constitution of Brazil is 238 pages long. The Constitution of South Africa is 114 pages long. The Constitution of the US is 8. It's broad, it's open-ended. Supreme Court Justice Jackson in the late 1940s talked about majestic generalities. There isn't anything there. That puts it a little bit too bluntly, but not much too bluntly. It is a common law constitution that goes up and down, back and forth, in and out. It always responds to events. It's going to respond to the events of a year ago. The notion of private property and constitutional protection for it is dramatically less than it was 65 years ago, largely because of the events of the Depression and the New Deal. Our understanding of free speech is much greater than it was 30 years ago, largely not because of anything directly about free speech, but largely because of court reactions to the Vietnam War and to the Civil Rights Movement. It's it should come as no surprise that there will be minor ebbs and flows, adjustments back and forth as we confront new events. That's the way the common law operates. Now, having said that, what kinds of adjustments have we seen? You mentioned correctly a concern about secret courts. I'm concerned, others are concerned. There are two dimensions of secret courts. One, they're secret, and two, they're courts. And one of the things worth thinking about is it is appropriate to be concerned about the fact that they are secret. But it's also appropriate to be somewhat proud of the fact that they are courts, somewhat proud of the fact that a whole range of anti-terrorist, national security issues are still, by virtually unanimous agreement of those in power, being channeled through the courts. I wish some of this were more public. But given a choice between secret courts and just doing it, I'd prefer secret courts. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is there a way in which secret courts themselves are a moderate triumph, and only a moderate triumph for rule of law ideas? Everything is still going through the system, and everybody knows there are secret courts. People who've written about privacy and have written about secrecy distinguish between first-order secrecy and second-order secrecy. First-order secrecy is secrecy that you don't even know that it's secret, you don't even know that it's happening. Second-order secrecy is an open, non-secret discussion about things being made secret. And in that sense, the fact that we have debates, that we have about how much should be secret, that we have set up separate courts that operate in partial view of everyone, at least we know they exist, should be a source of some comfort. Let me say something else in that vein that is a source of some comfort even for those of us who are critical of the degree of secrecy, critical of some of the detentions and the like. I probably shouldn't say this. I'm a lawyer. It's how I define myself. We ought not to overestimate the extent to which lawyers, courts, constitutional documents, and the like are the principal protectors of civil liberties. Civil liberties are much more likely to be protected by a range of public debate, public outrage, and the like than they are about people like me and others walking into court with writs and documents and things of that sort. One of the things that's happened in the last year that we can be moderately proud of is that it is perfectly acceptable to angrily denounce what is going on about secret courts, detentions, and everything else in ways that it was not in the past. During World War I in Australia, when those of German heritage were treated every bit as badly as those of Japanese heritage were treated in North America in the 1940s, there was essentially no dissent from any of this. In the 1940s in the US, none of the civil liberties organizations were at all active in protesting the internment or anything of that variety. This was a period, and the McCarthy period thereafter, when the American Civil Liberties Union would not allow communists to be members of the American Civil Liberties Union. The fact that now there are so many angry dissenting voices is and protection of angry dissenting voices is probably more of a protection than anything else. One final thing, even on the issue of courts. There is not very much indication now that courts are likely to just roll over. As long as we send things through the courts, as long as we send most things through the filter of life-tenured judges with large egos, and you can decide which of those is more important in preserving judicial independence. As long as we send almost everything that's going to happen through the filter of life-tenured judges with big egos, and leave open judicial challenges, I doubt that very much is going to happen other than minor adjustments one way or another, as we have seen throughout the history of civil liberties in this country. Less than a year ago, slightly, but in the order of things, the degree of adjustment is minor, and the degree of reinforcement of a quite strong civil liberties culture quite major.
Thank you. Dan, one of the cliches that was common immediately after 9/11, but it's continued for some time, is that 9/11 was the day when everything changed. And yet, if you look at American domestic politics, it's clear that one thing changed. The president's job approval rating went up, though it's slipped back down a bit. But he stands above where he did before 9/11. On the other hand, if the year 2000 election left us divided 50-50 politically, it looks like we're back to 50-50 again. What's changed politically in the last year?
You know, I spent 18 years in the Congress, so I ran 10 times, won 9 times, lost the last time. The voters of my district had very poor judgment in 1994. But I've thought about this issue a lot, and frankly, I don't think a lot has changed. First of all, you have this extraordinary 50-50 split in the United States Congress. The Democrats have basically 6 seats is all they need to pick up the U.S. House of Representatives. The Senate is 1 seat difference. It's only because of Senator Jeffords. So as much as members of Congress and elected officials around the country would like to talk about a higher level of politics, and I think there is a higher level, and you know, watching the emotion today, it almost makes you uncomfortable talking about politics in this context. But the fact is, as long as it's 50-50, it'll be down and dirty, and there's nothing that can be done about it. I asked myself, has this had any practical impact on politics so far? And you know, those of you from New York may have seen that the candidacy for governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, who was in the cabinet with me, made a comment about George Pataki. And remember, they asked him about Pataki, and they said, well, all Pataki has been doing since 9/11 is holding, all Pataki has been doing since 9/11 is holding Giuliani's coat. And I'm telling you, that was the kiss of death for my friend Andrew Cuomo. It seemed unseemly. I don't think he meant this as an unpatriotic way, but it had the impact of just turning the tide against him. So one thing that has happened since 9/11 is I think that people's attitudes towards the propriety of politics and how they act in terms of the unification of our country and the rest of the world, that has been elevated to some degree. In terms of the president, as you said, Joe, it has rehabilitated this president, given him a real mission. Some of you may remember, of course, after he was elected in a very marginal way with all the problems that occurred in Florida, and his ratings began to go down in the spring of the year 2001, and they went all the way down, and Gallup polled George Bush on September the 10th, 2001. His approval rating was 51%. 1 week after September 11th, he was at 85%. 2 weeks, he was at 90%. The highest ever recorded by the Gallup organization since the Second World War. And while his numbers have come down to some degree, and while I think the Democrats largely have the initiative on the domestic political issues, on Social Security and prescription drugs and Medicare and corporate responsibility, I think our president is pretty resilient, and I don't think that you're going to see any precipitous fall. That in fact, he's smart enough to keep this thing going, and you'll watch him tonight if you watch his address to the country, or you'll watch him tomorrow, and you'll watch him at the United Nations. Now, saying that, I will have to tell you that I think 9/11 will have very little impact on the congressional elections. John Harwood of the Wall Street Journal wrote a column a couple days ago, and the headline was, "Economic Anxiety Trumps War Talk." And I have to tell you, as a member of Congress for 18 years, economic issues, local issues, always dominated. I can't remember a member of Congress in recent years, and if there were, I can't say it, I can't remember it too aggressively right now, who's lost a race because of of issues of national security unless you do things in an unseemly or potentially patriotic way. The elections are very close. We have issues like social security, economic security. We have the stock market, which has dropped on average about 20% this year. These issues will dominate the American political system. And notwithstanding what happens during the war effort, I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. Particularly in normal off-year election years, the party out of power tends to pick up seats anyway. Will Rogers made an interesting comment once. He once said that, you know, he says, America has two of the very greatest friends in the world. You know who they are. They are the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Now, the truth of the matter is that 9/11 challenged that. But in terms of how people vote in this country, I think Will Rogers is still on target. And I think people will largely end up voting because of these domestic political issues, particularly if there continues to be a lot of economic anxiety around the United States. I recall, if I just may close with this comment, Dick Gephardt, who is Majority Leader of the House, who wants to either be Speaker of the House or President of the United States, the Congress was in New York for a joint session. Some of you may have seen that. And he made a great speech there. And he said, in this great and faithful struggle, there are no Republicans, there are no Democrats, there are only Americans. Unfortunately, what he didn't say is that there are elections, and he wants to win this one. And I think that's the bottom line.
Thank you, Dan. Let's throw it open for your participation now. You'll see the two mics here on the floor and two mics in the two balconies here. Unlike usual forums where you're only supposed to ask a question, tonight you can also make a comment, a dissent or your own views or whatever. But whether it's a question or a comment, it has to be brief. So let's start up. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mike Goldstone, KSG 99. And this question is for you, Dean Nye. Could you comment on the expanded role of public health since 9/11 and what kind of impact that will have on the school's agenda?
Well, it just so happens I wrote an op-ed in the International Herald Tribune about 2 weeks ago on the fact that we now have to think of global public health as a national security issue. The idea that you can run a public health system with inadequate resources at home, as made clear by the anthrax attacks, no longer holds. But in addition to that, it's not clear how you're going to separate public health conditions here and abroad. You need a clear baseline, you need early warnings, unlike a bomb that goes off where you immediately know there's been an explosion. A biological attack, you may not see the symptoms for several days or even a week. And you're going to need an international network where you have clear baselines and early warnings. And I think we're only beginning to come to terms, as Ash suggested, with the fact that we need a stronger domestic public health system, but you can't divorce that in a globalized world from a global public health system. I think we're going to have to do a lot more about it, and that means we're going to have to do more about it here in the school as well. We have some people who know a lot, seated to my left, but we're going to have to know more.
Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Catherine. I work here at the Kennedy School in the National Security Program. I have a question for Dr. Carter. You mentioned that the attack of September 11th was not just an attack on America, but a more general attack on values and culture. Nevertheless, I'm wondering if in the administration there has been any talk about America's perception abroad and whether we should be doing anything to change that.
Well, I don't know about whether there's been discussion in the administration, but there ought to have been discussion in the administration, because this is a crucial point that I think we were all trying to think through, and I remember this clearly last fall. The way I thought about it at the time, and still do, is I, like Joe and Jess and some others who have followed the terrorism issue for a while, had followed bin Laden for a while. He wasn't known to many people, but he was known to us. Been following him since maybe 96 or something. And during that time, the peace process in the Middle East went up and down, and we had this position, we had that position. The prospects looked close, they looked distant. And all during that time, bin Laden, he didn't change his strategy at all. So I thought we were kidding ourselves if we thought that by changing our conduct, that we would change the ferocity of al-Qaeda's assaults on us. That the only alternative we had for al-Qaeda was to attack al-Qaeda. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways in which our behavior, if changed, could A, help us win the support we needed in the region and everything to carry that out, to protect ourselves. And it didn't mean that there wasn't a broader sense in which we made it easy for people to support someone like bin Laden, who clearly had the intention to attack us. And I think President Bush did basically the right thing when he said, all right, from now on, we're not going to have the nonsense we had with the Taliban, government of Afghanistan, to a certain extent with the Pakistani government, and to a certain extent with governments around the region, Saudi, Egyptian, and so forth, where those who clearly had the intent to attack the United States were given, in various degrees, active and passive support. All that went on. So we didn't create the fundamental motivations, as I said, for the attacks upon us. And I didn't think there was anything we could do in our own conduct that could stem them. But our own conduct is important in creating an environment in which we can be effective at preventing and responding to terrorism. And that's true here at home as well. I'll make one other point. I know I'm giving you a long answer, but if you think about al-Qaeda and that form of terrorism, it's so different from the terrorists of the 60s and 70s because they had a motive and a political agenda that Americans could understand. Bin Laden might as well have come from Mars to most Americans. He was pure terror. The Red Brigades, the terrorists that grew up in the Black Panther period, and you could have labeled them terrorists, were embedded in our politics. That's a much harder thing for us to deal with. So I think as we think about civilization in the long run and terrorism in the long run, you really do have to ask yourself, what is it about the way you conduct your society that gives rise to terrorism, but also makes it effective as you combat it, makes it possible for us to be effective at protecting ourselves while still running the kind of country we want to live in, the kind of world we want to live in. Left balcony.
Thank you. My name is Florinal. I'm a first-year MBA student here. My first question goes to Professor Carter as well. What role in this present context do you see for the European allies as a natural ally to the United States and, well, with us as a space that shares the same values? How can they help if they wish to? And related to that, a second question.
No, we're going to have one per customer because there are really quite a lot of people lined up. So
This is academic. For our dean, Joseph Nye, how can you explain the absence, the total absence, the virtual absence of any course on EU or European matters from this year's curriculum?
Well, unfortunately, one of the people that taught that's on leave. But Ash, why don't you answer the first part?
The answer that I'd like to be true to your question is that Europeans regard themselves as similarly situated as societies to us. They're interconnected, they're vulnerable, they're pluralistic, they're trying to keep on keeping on in the face of a technological trends that make aberrant individuals and groups more dangerous than in the past. I always say to American policymakers who complain about Europeans or don't wish to be multilateral in our approach to problems, if we can't get along with the Europeans, who can we get along with? out there. If you look at shared values, a shared physical situation in terms of our vulnerability and the type of society we have. So to me, this problem says you have to look around at who your friends are in the world, and if we can't get along with the Europeans, we're in real trouble.
Right, Balcony.
Thank you. My name is Jim Craig. I'm a mid-career student here. This one's for Professor Stern, and forgive me if I misquote, hastily scribbling. One of your quotes in your opening statement was, our military actions have caused a new form of al-Qaeda, the implication being more dangerous, more unpredictable. The question is, what specific actions, inactions, or failures did our military do? And following up on that, what should we have done?
Well, I tried to make clear that there's an inevitable trade-off between short-term, immediate national security objectives and long-term objectives, and I think we did exactly the right thing, but this is just a negative side effect of actions that were critically important for us to take. And I guess I'm a little bit less sanguine than Ash. Yes, we've taken out, to some extent, the corporate headquarters of this organization, but what it's doing is using other organizations that also have corporate headquarters. It's a new kind of hybrid organization that's formed as a result of our pushing al-Qaeda out, although of course they're coming back in now too.
Let's go to the floor.
I'm Siping from Singapore. This question is back to Professor Carter. There's a saying that, if we do not learn the lesson from history, we'll tend to make the same mistake. My question is, from the international affair perspective, what is the greatest lesson from 9/11 for the world in general?
The large lesson I take away personally was the one that I closed on, which is that al-Qaeda is an important phenomenon in its own right. Islam, the Middle East, as areas in ferment, important problems in their own right. America, its situation in the world, important problems in its own right. But what you're really seeing here is an instance, which the anthrax attack was another instance of this problem of mass destructive power falling into smaller and smaller numbers of hands. That's the long-term problem of governance, and it affects all societies. And it only gets worse as technology gets better. It doesn't get better.
Let me tag on a brief thought of my own on this, which is I agree very strongly with Ash. Timothy McVeigh, the worst terrorist we had before 9/11, had nothing to do with Islam. Aum Shinrikyo in Japan that spread sarin in the subways had nothing to do with Islam. What's really happening is technology is putting into the hands of deviant groups and individuals powers that were once reserved solely to governments. If you wanted to kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in the 20th century, you had to be a Hitler or a Stalin or a Mao and have the apparatus of a government. If terrorists get hold of weapons of mass destruction, they will have that capacity. That matters profoundly for what we think of as governance in democracies and gets very much to Fred's area. I first started looking at this in 1994 when I was asked to do a national intelligence estimate for the president about terrorism after the World Trade Center. And we first started looking at the sort of what you would expect the normal things were. The deeper we got into it, the more we felt that terrorism using biological weapons or substances or nuclear was going to change the dimensions of this problem tremendously. So you might think of normal terrorism, and we've lived with that for decades, centuries. But you might think of a trend in terrorism which is going to create profound new questions for governance. And I think Ash's answer to that is exactly right. And it has to be a top item on the agenda for us here at the school.
Joe,
Fred and Dan.
Let me add a footnote to that. We also have a free speech, free press culture in this country that developed around the idea that the fringe speakers were people urging people to do things rather than telling them how to do things. the free speech, free press, legal challenges for the next 10 years are going to be, how will the courts and a society deal with plans and recipes and instructions for doing things, not with how they will deal with advocacy or inflammatory speech. We have no theory and no doctrine to teach us how to deal with plans, recipes, and instructions.
But Fred,
and that's
those
the risk.
plans and recipes and instructions have been on the internet for so many years. I mean, since I was a grad student, I was able to get recipes for chemical agents, which I actually did while Ash was my advisor.
Let's sit down.
I would just say that America, this isolationist spirit may be changing a bit. The Pew Charitable Trust just did this poll, which came out on September 5th. It's the most extensive poll of Americans done since 9/11, and it says that Americans do believe in being more engaged, more proactive rather than reactive. You know, our share of our national budget going to various forms of foreign assistance has never been at as low a level as it is right now. And, you know, as a country, we're going to have to ask ourselves a lot of questions about whether we can afford to remain as isolated and disengaged and just react when these kinds of things happen. It's not the only answer, but it's partial to the answer.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Brian Monroe. I'm a Neiman Fellow. And would like to hear from the panel we were talking earlier about, as the country and the administration is engaged in this new war on terrorism, we've seen an increased use of secrecy and reduced access. Has one of the casualties of this war been the press and press access, or is that just an acceptable level of collateral damage?
Fred was also, in addition to being academic dean, Stanton professor, was a fellow of the Shorenstein Center on Press and Politics, so I'll ask him to.
The access issue has always been intriguing because it is largely a political one rather than a technical legal one. The press argued in the early 1970s that the First Amendment granted an affirmative right of press access to the forums and decision-making domains of government. They lost. They lost over and over again in the early 1970s. And one consequence of that is that virtually all of the arguments for press access tend to be political arguments or negotiated arguments, or the First Amendment as a political weapon rather than a matter of legal doctrine. There's a little bit less access now than there was before, but not much. In the political give and take about access, one of the real issues is to what extent will the press, which doesn't have a First Amendment right to affirmative access, become more mainstream in order to get access? Who gets invited to the press conferences? Who gets invited to the briefings? Who gets invited to be on the aircraft carriers, to be at the bases, and the like? One of the things I worry about when we think about access is that although access is a good thing, if you have too many members of the press too concerned about getting access, one consequence of that is that you don't have enough of the press really out there on the fringes saying nasty, damaging, angry kinds of things. I worry a little bit about not enough access, but I worry a lot about members of the press so concerned about preserving their fragile right of access that they are not willing to say very strong things that ought to be said.
Left balcony.
I'm Rick Thomas, a National Security Fellow here. I have a question for Dr. Stern. Doctor, to what would you attribute the failings of our intelligence community? And is it a stretch to suggest that societal factors are involved, like a collective sense of risk aversion?
Sounds like we ought to ask you to provide the answer. I thought Milt Bearden's analysis in Sunday's paper was really very good. That yes, that there is a feeling of risk aversion in the intelligence community. he's the one who said no one wants to go where the water has to be filtered, and we have this problem that we're not good at it anymore. We don't want to do it anymore.
And you would say that it's really we, the people, that are probably involved in that. It's our sense of risk aversion as well.
I'm not sure I'm really an authority on this.
I think
You are.
the society as a whole is risk averse. I think with the proper incentives, you can recruit people who are 2 standard deviations from the mean who will be more risk averse. You don't need that many.
And the Congress has also been very risk averse, and they're the ones that appropriate money for the intelligence communities, and they're the ones that will do retroactive oversight when it serves them. I was in that role. I did it myself on many occasions.
And I had to testify before him. Right, Balcony.
Hello, I'm Jenny Scherer, MPA2 student at the Kennedy School. My question is to Mr. Glickman. I'm wondering, or I'm astounded about the Iraq discourse which is happening in this country at the time. To my understanding, any military intervention in Iraq without a UN mandate would be a clear violation of international law. Now, I'm wondering whether such a discourse has become possible through 9/11, or what impact does 9/11 have that the US can maintain such a discourse, which, at least from a European perspective, or let's say from a German perspective, is rather astonishing.
Well, I can't comment on whether it's against international law or not, and my colleagues on this side would know much more than I, but I think it is actually getting better. That is, for a while, I think that the Congress was somewhat either unsure or intimidated by the 9/11 situation, and were somewhat fearful of challenging the president on national security and foreign policy issues. I think that's changing. I think there is beginning to be a more genuine debate. The president has now made the decision that he has to go to Congress. First of all, when the president's father's all senior advisors basically tell him he's going down the wrong road and you better shape up, son, he finally thought that that was a smart thing to do. So he's going to go to Congress, he's going to go to the United Nations, and I think that, that in fact the system is working. It's taken a little longer than a lot of people would like to have seen.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, we really have so many people lined up. We're going to have to do one per customer. Yes.
I think we're all quite pleased that the country is not sunk.
Please identify yourself first.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm David Cohen. I'm a mid-career student. I think we're all quite pleased that during the past year the nation is not sunk into a sense of xenophobia and intolerance. But it's interesting that John Leo last week in the U.S. News and World Report had an interesting editorial that there does not seem to be a sense of anger in the country about what has happened. There's a sense of sadness, of grief, but not of anger. There's no remember the Maine, remember Pearl Harbor. I'm interested in the panel's thoughts. Is this because of a change in the body politic? Is it because of the nature of our adversaries? Is this a good thing, or is this something that we should be worried about?
Dan?
I think the world has changed so much. The method of receiving information is so diffused. I think that you're probably right, although I didn't live back then, and I don't really know what average people in the heartland felt about these things. But in Pearl Harbor, within 60 days, we had about 400,000 troops called up, and a draft was ready to go. You know, the absence of a draft has a lot to do with minimizing personal impact of these kinds of things. You think about it. I mean, we can all wring our hands and talk about how bad it is, but as long as there's nothing personally hitting us in the gut, you know, we can go live our lives the normal way. And so we're not seeing really any hardship as a country, except, of course, those who suffered the direct damage, which was catastrophic and monumental. But, you know, on the other hand, I do believe that there is an extraordinary sense of patriotism in this country, and people are generally more unified, and I think that we're in better shape today in terms of a national purpose than we were before 9/11.
Yes.
My name is Diane Tucker. I'm actually a student at the Arts and Sciences in Middle Eastern Studies, hoping to come and study here afterward. This is actually sort of a joint question for Professors Stern and Carter. Perhaps more focused to Professor Stern because of answer Professor Carter already gave. The two of you seem to have very different frameworks for understanding terrorism. Professor Carter as sort of an aberrance or deviance that has to be fought no matter the motivation, and Professor Stern as sort of who listens to narratives. And I imagine that sort of split is sustained in the government in terms and has a role in sort of creating our policy. I wonder, Professor Stern, whether you have a sense that your framework has been addressed and has been used much by our government and in response to September 11th. I spent the spring and summer, the winter and spring in Egypt. There's no one in the world that likes Mubarak less than Egyptians as far as I'm concerned. I mean, part of what, I'm just wondering, our government seems to be getting caught in protests within Arab countries, and we become the enemies. I wonder whether you think we've listened enough and considered at all our policies in any concrete terms, listened enough to terrorists and their protests.
Well, Ash and I have always disagreed about just about everything, even though I adore him, just to make that clear. I obviously think it is important to understand terrorist grievances. I mean, there is this problem, what Joe has called the privatization of war. The technology is definitely making terrorism easier. Fortunately, it's also making counterterrorism easier. But we do know that it'll be easier and easier for smaller and smaller groups to attack us. And for that reason, I think it's critically important that we understand the grievances of these people, that we, whatever they are, sometimes they're, I have to say, imaginary, but nonetheless, I think we need to listen to them. It doesn't mean that by taking on an empathic stance that we are sympathizing with the terrorists. We can still condemn the action and say that it is evil. But I think it's important to listen.
But I might add that these are not incompatible. Think of technology as enhancing the supply side and grievances enhancing the demand side, and you have a problem. Yes.
Can I just say, say something about it? Because I don't see it. Maybe we have other disagreements, but I don't see it in this case. Of course you need to understand I would like to know why the anthrax bomber did what the anthrax bomber did. As well, and I'm interested in the motivations of al-Qaeda. But I do believe that you have to draw a line in terms of the kind of conduct that is permissible to somebody who has views with which you disagree, and flying airplanes into somebody's buildings is not on the scale as far as I'm concerned. So I am interested in understanding, and I'm interested in introspection in terms of how we can change the conditions of human life so that that kind of rage doesn't build up anywhere for any kind of motivation. That said, somebody who wants to have women dress in burqas and fly airplanes into buildings is, to me, a problem that needs to be confronted, and I will use that understanding to confront the problem and to build the support I need to go after the problem. But that's where I am on somebody like al-Qaeda. That's not okay in civilized life.
Left balcony.
Jonathan Levy, I'm a mid-career student. Professor Schauer, I noticed myself uncomfortable with some of your remarks, so I wanted to address that. You talked about us knowing about secret courts and that there are some groups that are outraged as progress. And as I was listening to you, my reaction and my thought is that that's not good enough. That I want more for our country, and I sort of demand more. And I also sort of flashed on McCarthyism, and remember that everyone knew about McCarthyism, but its downfall was really when the hearings were on national TV, and it was "Have you no shame," and that was sort of the end of him. So I was wondering, since you know more about it than I do, I believe, do you agree? And why or why not? Do you agree that it's not good enough?
Whether it is good enough depends on what the alternative is. That is, we certainly accept in a large number of different areas that at times we will need courts to operate in secret. Here I'm not talking about national security. I'm talking about various areas of personal privacy, search warrants, and things of that sort. We're reasonably comfortable with judges looking at materials, as it is said in legalese, in camera, rather than in public, to see whether a search warrant will be issued or whether somebody's privacy will be protected or whatever. As I said, I wish less were being done in secret. I agree with you that it is not good enough. On the other hand, if the question is compared to what could have happened, what has happened in the last year, then maybe my answer is a little bit more moderate. Or in addition, if we ask the question in a somewhat different way, when there are trials, is the likelihood that a defendant will get off as high as it has been in the past? Not quite, but there is some likelihood of that. I actually think that we operate a criminal procedure system appropriately more defendant-oriented than any other in the world, appropriately one in which the possibility of a guilty defendant getting off is higher than anywhere else. I've seen a little weakening of that, but only a little. We ought to worry about it, but it's perhaps, there are consequences of over-worrying in the sense that we have not completely privatized the military. We have not completely privatized the idea of war. I wish I could be less pragmatic. But in a strictly pragmatic sense, I don't want to create too many incentives for the people with guns, bombs, and lots of dollars to entirely circumvent the legal system. So I have many of the same worries that you do, but I also have some pride and some confidence in the fact that all of these debates are still debates that we have appropriately hyper-legalized.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're well past our terminal time. One last question, if it's quick.
Sure. My name is Larry Harris. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School MPP program. My question is, one thing that was noticeably absent from the panel is, what are young people's perceptions and feelings toward government post-September 11th? That before there was a heightened sense of cynicism toward government, and people didn't want to get involved, and post there was a spike in civic interest. And I wonder what your feelings are on how we might sustain that civic interest and turn it into long-term civic engagement or sustained civic engagement, especially considering that post World War II, for example, there were institutions put in place that maintained people's connection to the United States, rock gardens and the war bonds during the war and the Civilian Defense Corps as examples, and maybe what are those institutions going to be post September 11th?
Dan will give you the short final answer.
Well, that's of course what we're trying to do at the Institute of Politics, is to create an opportunity for people to find that politics is relevant to their lives and they can make a difference, and it does make a difference. But I'll tell you, we were out in the yard registering students 2 days ago. And I don't know if anybody here was out there, but we registered about 500 students to vote, just walking in line. Now, I think we were like a football team, and we tackled people, and we got them to do it. But the fact of the matter is that there was more interest, I'm told by the staff, among young people coming up and asking, what are you doing? What kind of things are you having? How can we get engaged and involved, than they had seen for a very long time. I'm not telling you it's wonderful. Listen, the political system in this country just, in a way, discourages people from getting engaged in politics. I mean, just watch TV on the news. You see these splendidly informative political political ads that encourage people to think, right? You know, and you know, and the money in politics and all the other things, but the fact of the matter is it does make a difference. I mean, your voice may make a difference whether we go into Iraq or not, or under what circumstances. It's made a difference in major political movements in this country. People have been very disengaged in this country for a very long time, and I'm telling you that means fewer and fewer people will have their hands on the decision lever. And so our job is to try to enhance that, encourage it, and show that it does make a difference.
Well, we have come to the end of our time for this forum. I suspect that the topic is one which we will wind up discussing together in various venues during the course of this year. We know a little more than we did a year ago. We still have a lot more to learn, but we are a community that's dedicated to learning. We look forward to continuing to work on this together in the year that's before us. I should add that tonight we will be showing President Bush's speech here on the big screen at 9 o'clock for those who wish to watch it here, though you'll have to use the courtyard entrance to enter. So thank you all for coming, and I wish you well with the year, and please join me in thanking the panel.